host and co-organizer of this sixth Pedretti Lecture, Professor Michele Emdin, both distinguished scholars in the field of cardiology and heart surgery. I am deeply grateful to the former for having accepted the invitation to speak about the extraordinary relevance of Leonardo's anatomical studies on the heart, and to the latter for having accepted our proposal to organize together these events in one of the most prestigious centers in this field of study. To explain what the Pedretti Lecture are and what we have organized so far, we have prepared a flyer that you can find, you have prepared near the entrance. So I would now like to say only a few words about our foundation and the figure of Carlo Pedretti, whom these lectures intend to remember and honor. The foundation was established by the will of Rossana Pedretti, Carlo's wife, on the artistic, bibliographic, archival heritage collected during their life and housed in the villa of Castel Vitoni in Lamporecchio, with the only exception of the most precious artworks. These are kept in an external maximum security vault from which they come out only for important exhibition. The latest one, the one organized in Rome by the Lincei Academy 2 years ago for the 500th anniversary of Leonardo's death. The purpose of the foundation is to continue the works of Carlo Pedretti, one of the leading scholars of Leonardo works, and is mainly carried out by his former students, Margherita Melani and Sara Taglialagamba, both of whom are parts of our board of directors. This is not easy. This is not easy task because Carlo Pedretti was not a traditional art historian for two fundamental reasons. Firstly, for his highly interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary perspective required to seriously investigate Leonardo's work in all its variety and complexity. Secondly, for his rigorously empiristic and anti-metaphysical approach to the history of art itself, followed in his tireless work of attributing and dating the works and writings of Leonardo. In this chronological ordering that has made it possible to understand what happened to be contradiction of Leonardo thought, the many oscillations in Leonardo's thought, which were instead linked to the evolution of his thought. For this fundamental innovative contribution to the study of Leonardo's work, the Faculty of Letters and Philosophy of the University of Urbino awarded Carlo an honorary degree in literature in October 1998. This was the beginning of a fruitful relations where the center, with our university, where we create firstly the Center for Studies on Leonardo and the Renaissance, and subsequently the Centro Interdipartimentale Urbino and Perspective, that has a subtitle, long subtitle, but an important one, From the Mathematical Humanism of Piero della Francesca and Leonardo da Vinci to the Galilean Revolution, still active in promoting seminars, workshops, summer school in partnership with our foundation. I would like to conclude by extending my greetings to all participants in today's event, both in presence and remotely, thanks to the impeccable organization of Scuola Sant'Anna, for which I would like to express my gratitude again to Professor Emdin.
Thank you, Professor Tarozzi. I would like to invite Melania to briefly introduce the figure of Professor Wells.
Francis Wells is a cardiothoracic surgeon based at the Royal Papworth Hospital, part of University of Cambridge Group of Specialist Hospitals, trained in London, Cambridge, and at the University of Alabama in Birmingham, Alabama, where he was a senior research fellow to Professor John Kirklin, a founding father of modern cardiac surgical practice. His specialist area of interest has been heart valve reconstruction, cardiopulmonary transplantation, and the surgical management of intrathoracic malignancy, with more than 250 published papers and several books on the subject. In parallel with his clinical practice, Francis has had a lifelong interest in the arts and a specific interest in the Rinascimento, having studied in depth the work of Leonardo da Vinci. This work led recently to the publication of his book, The Earth of Leonardo. I have our copy with the most important foreword by Prince Charles. He has sponsored several artists in residence within his clinical practice, and this has led to several pieces which have appeared in major exhibitions, including in the 2006 Royal Academy Summer Show. Himself, a recipient of Sir Casson Prize for drawing, shared with Paula Rego and Frank Auerbach. Francis enjoyed drawing, painting, and playing the piano as amateur, but with much gusto.
Thank you, Melania. I asked two of our medical students, Michela Chianca and Giorgia Panichella, to introduce Professor Wells' lecture. I would like that Michela would now give her presentation.
Yes. Okay. Okay. Good evening to everyone. With this short talk, I'm going to discuss the state of the art in medicine in Leonardo's time. The medical Renaissance began in the early 16th century. It was a period of progress in European medical knowledge with a renovated interest in the ideas of the ancient Greek and Roman civilization, along with Arabic Persian medicine, as a result of the translation into Latin of many works from these societies. Progress made during the medical Renaissance depend on several factors. Printed book based on movable type, adopted in Europe from the middle of the 16th century, allowed the diffusion of medical ideas and anatomical diagrams. In addition, the Church, with the papal bulls, the Cadaverum Dissezione of Sixtus IV and Clement VII, resolved all ambiguous interpretation on previous disposition regarding impediments to human dissection. Pope Sixtus IV, in the Cadaverum Sectione, declared anatomy to be useful for medical and artistic practice. Finally, in Italy, in the 15th and 16th century, the philosophy of science and humanism were born. The flourishing of the university in Italy allowed the development of scientific progress that characterized this period. The study of anatomy was one of the main foundations of progress in the Renaissance medicine. Looking back to its origins, the first experiment in anatomy originated in Greece. The beauty of the human body drove some great personalities, including Galeno, to dissect monkeys and pigs for scientific reasons. Despite the contribution of Greek thought, modern anatomy will be born much later in Christian Europe, or even better in Italy. In fact, as said before, it was here that the first university arose, and it was also there that cadaver dissection took place as early as the 13th century. First, for the autopsy examination of the body of those who died in dubious circumstances, and then for teaching purposes, to learn more about the organs and the structure of the human body. With regard to dissection, it was conducted in a specific structure named anatomical theaters. Anatomical theater was usually a room or a roundly amphitheatrical shape, in the center of which would stand a table on which the dissection of human or animal bodies took place. Around this table were several circular, elliptic, or octagonal tiers with railings so that observers could stand and observe the dissection below. Anatomy studies were, since the 16th century, always accompanied by a temporary theatre. Only in the 1594, at the University of Padua, was built the first permanent anatomical theatre. At the time of Leonardo, another important character of Renaissance medicine emerged. It was Andrea Vesalio. Vesalio graduated from the University of Padua after training in Paris and being appointed explicator chirurge of this Italian university. During these years, as a professor, he wrote his great work, De Humani Corporis Fabrica. This work is often cited as the first real work of modern medicine, as it marks the overcoming of the Gallenic conception of man. In the Humani Corporis Fabrica, the author points out about 220 errors in the work of Galen. Moreover, Vesalio's work traces an innovative conception of anatomy, since seen as a functional anatomy rather than a topographical anatomy. In his Anatomy Treatise, Vesalio will talk about the great anatomical and physiological discovery of the time, the pulmonary circulation. After these historic excursus, I conclude my short talk about the state of the art of medicine in Leonardo's time.
Thank you, Michela. And now Sarah will finally introduce the lecture of Professor Wells.
Thank you. May I ask to put my PowerPoint presentation, please? Regia, possibile avere la presentazione PowerPoint, per favore?
Può dare la presentazione della professoressa Taglia alla Gamba? Sara?
Sì.
Più vicino al microfono.
One of the most important characteristics of the anatomical drawings by Leonardo is that he put together the scientist, and the artist, creating an unsurpassed case of perfect integration between visual art and medical science. The role of Leonardo in the history of anatomy emerged for two basic reasons. First, the method of work chosen, that is direct practice of dissection, proceeding in an inverse way compared to the model of the anatomical demonstration held by Bondino de Luzzi. Leonardo, in fact, proceeds alone and from the outside to the inside, looking for the reason for the motions and beauty of the human body. Leonardo pushed himself far beyond what was necessary to an artist, because in the Renaissance it was usual for painters and sculptors such as Pollaiolo, Michelangelo, or even the master Verrocchio to dissect. The second reason is about the proposed scope, that is the use of the drawing for illustrating the anatomized human body, according to its definition that painting is the supreme among the sciences. Thus, Leonardo introduced some technique of study, such as the median sagittal section of the skull, of the rachies, of the thorax, and the cross-sectional subdivisions of limbs. And of course, he used wax models. Above all, he applies to anatomy and technology the same schematic and technical drawing of an object, marking the birth of the modern scientific illustration. He used, just as you can see in the first drawing, the exploded view drawings, and he used muscles understood as a metal wireless, as you can see in the second drawing. And at the end of his life, he see muscles and tendons understood as lines of force that become the graphic demonstration of mechanical laws. This is perfectly described in his last drawing, the blue one, with the movement and structure of the anatomy of the neck, used like the ship's mast or ad uso di albero di nave, as Leonardo states. It can be said that following his studies on anatomia naturalis and according to a new and revolutionary definition of biomechanics, Leonardo reaches the idea of anatomia artificialis to better illustrate the human body and its functions. After Leonardo's death, his anatomical drawings passed through many hands and disappear completely for more than a century until the 18th century. Carlo Pedretti edited and published the entire collection of Leonardo's anatomical drawings from the Royal Collection at Windsor Castle in 1969, and later as corpus of the anatomical studies in the collection of Her Majesty the Queen at Windsor Castle with Dr. Kenneth Keel in a magnificent edition by Jason Reprint Corporation in New York in 1980. Pedretti's contributions were essential to scholar and also to divulge to a larger audience Leonardo's anatomical drawings. We should mention the exhibition across Europe of the anatomical drawings from the Royal Collection in Windsor, the books L'Anatomia di Leonardo from Da Mondino a Berengario and Il Tempio dell'Anima in collaboration with Paola Salvi. In 2018, Francis Wells was invited by Professor Carlo Pedretti in his house in Lamporecchio, a couple of months before his death. That beautiful afternoon is part of his legacy now. After that meeting, many projects would follow, and this is the main reason why we are greatly honored to be here today.
Thank you, Sarah. And now I'm asking Professor Wells to give his lecture.
Well, whilst the slides are coming on, can I say what a pleasure it is to be here and an honor to be invited by you, sir. And also, Sarah and Melina, thank you very much for making me part of this wonderful organization. If I could have the first slide, please.
Possiamo iniziare con la presentazione? Sì.
Yes. That's better. I can breathe now. Thank you. Well, I became very interested in Leonardo many years ago, my interest was really set alight when I saw the 1977 exhibition at the Royal Academy in London, and was able to see the drawings for the first time in life. And this has led to a lifetime of interest in this work. And what I hope to be able to share with you this afternoon is the realism that Leonardo found in his work, his scientific work, that still speaks to us today. We as cardiologists, cardiac surgeons, can look at his work and relate in real time to what he was talking about. So just very briefly, who was this man? Who was Leonardo. I don't have time to tell you very much about his life, but I just want to remind you from this wonderful painting, The School of Athens in the Vatican by Raphael, huge respect to him. Michelangelo's down here looking a bit moody, but he put Leonardo right center in this work of the School of Athens, the School of Knowledge. He no, going the wrong way. He was born the son of a notary from Vinci, who ended up working in Florence, and probably a local peasant girl, Caterina. We don't have time to discuss this very much, but I just want to make the point that at his birth, it was celebrated, despite being illegitimate, in this little church, perhaps at that baptistry, as the plaque on the wall claims. And it was there were 10 witnesses present. We know this because his grandfather recorded in a notary handbook. It seems to want to go the wrong way. This is Vinci, which you all know much better than I do. And his father, very soon after this liaison with Caterina, married someone else with whom he had no children. But Leonardo was left in Vinci with his grandfather, his uncle, and perhaps his mother from time to time, who knows. But it was a very rural upbringing. This is the sort of surroundings, as you know, and it's quite likely that his interest in natural philosophy and nature developed at this time from being a child in this wonderful area. Not a lot more is known about him until he appears in the School of Verrocchio in Florence, one of the two principal studios along with the Paoluila brothers. And it's likely that his father introduced him to Verrocchio. His father at the time was a notary to the Medici in Florence. And what intrigues me is, as a medical student, and those of you who are still medical students, that his fellow students were Perugino and Botticelli, not a bad firm to be on when you're training in a subject such as art. But what I really want to draw your attention to is the entry into the local St. Luke fraternity, where he was admitted when he basically finished his training with Verrocchio. And the St. Luke fraternity was that for the doctors, the pharmacologists, as well as the artists. So one wonders what kind of association he may have had as a young man in Florence. So what framed his way of thinking? Because it is important when we get on to look at the detail of what I want to show you to ask this question. Well, he had a non-classical education because of illegitimacy. Maybe he was in a lax family environment. He could do what he wanted to when he wanted to. He grew up in natural surroundings, and apparently he was something of a musician and also obviously an artist in childhood. A flamboyant dresser, someone who was well liked, enjoyed company, and was a popular person to be around. He had the desire to understand everything around him. And some of you may know this book by Kahneman, Fast and Slow Thinking. And the idea is that if you come to an idea very quickly, you may come to the wrong idea. But as you read Leonardo's notes, and his notes are very well worth reading, they're beautifully written, very succinct use of words. You can see him arguing with himself why something should be as it is and what would happen if it wasn't as it is. He also, despite his lack of a formal education, seems to have had a bit of a bad time with the academics around him, because he writes quite angrily about the way the academics are dealing with him. So he was a proud man, he was well read, and he actually had very strong personal ideas. These are his words. He wrote, "If indeed I have no power to quote from authors as they have, the academics around him, it's a far bigger and more worthy thing to read by the light of experience, which is the mistress of their instructors. They strut about puffed up, pompous, decked out and adorned, not with their own labels, but those of others, and they won't allow me my own. So the students in the room always feel free to express your own thoughts and to think widely. Don't just listen to exactly what you're being told." He was interested in experimentation. He didn't take things as they appeared. He actually looked into how and tried to understand the function of things around him in the natural world. And he again said he wanted to make his own deductions and his own ideas from what he saw and that which he could test. Anatomy in the time of Leonardo and its usefulness to the artist is perhaps summarized by these words from Leon Battista Alberti in his text on painting, where he said, "You must identify the bones of an animal, add the muscles, then clothe it with flesh. It's necessary for an artist to be a good anatomist so that he can design the naked parts of the human frame and to know the sinews, bones, nerves, and muscles." But why do I say that to you? Well, as you'll see as we go on, Leonardo went much, much further than that. Leonardo's anatomy was not simply to end up as a very good artist. The other concept I want to introduce to you before I get on to my main subject is one of the great philosophical debates at that time, and it still is, was between the microcosm, the smallest observable parts of the universe, and the macrocosm, the largest parts. Where did man fit in? And he said, if man's construction should appear to you to be of a marvelous artifice, remember that it is nothing compared to the soul which inhabits such architecture, and truly, be it what it may, it is a divine thing. So he's really making the point that as humans, we are very special in this huge cosmos that surrounds us. And of course, it's trying to understand the microcosm, macrocosm paradigm is still here trying to sort out the difference between quantum and Newtonian physics. We still can't make the link. So this kind of thinking is still with us today, very forward thoughts. This is Ptolemy's Geographica, and the reason I show you this is because Leonardo knew this work. He was a great cartographer, drawing maps himself, but also you'll see that when we get onto the human body, the map of the human body was a fascination to him. So it was the general relationship of structures, not just the specific. Here's an example of one of his drawings of the rivers, a beautiful map that he was doing at the time. There are many of these in the Windsor collection. And on the other side, you can see his map of the human body, probably in the mid-1507, 1508, perhaps at the time when he was in Milan. And it's a summary drawing. He used to like to summarize where he got to. And this is a very complicated drawing. It isn't simply the anatomy of a woman. This is the anatomy of an ox. This is an ox uterus. This is fetal circulation. This is the circulation of the placenta to the fetus at the link between the umbilicus. You see the beautiful idea of the heart still as a two-chamber structure, very Gallenic in nature. And as Sarah's already mentioned, the use of drawing is particularly important. We have schematic, we have representational, and if you perhaps can't see it, the thyroid gland is done in translucency. So there's all sorts of things in this drawing. He said, although human ingenuity makes various inventions corresponding by means of various machines to the same end, it will never discover any inventions more beautiful, more appropriate, or more direct than nature, because in her inventions, nothing's lacking and nothing is superfluous. So in other words, you can learn from nature, take seriously what you see, and look very carefully. He engaged in thought experiments, and this is one of the most striking thought experiments. Galen, as you've already heard from the medical students' little exposition at the beginning, Galen had the idea that the liver was the seat of the circulation, that the blood was formed in the liver, it passed to the heart, and the heart's function was to churn the blood, to heat it, and also to mix it with the sooty vapors in the lungs to expel the bad products of what we now know as metabolism. Of course, we now know heat comes from the metabolic process, but they didn't in those days. Leonardo didn't agree with this. So he set out with this little thought experiment to say, rather like the seed of a plant, the roots grow down and the branches grow up. So it is with the heart. The veins go towards the heart and the arteries away from it. So the heart is the center of the circulation, not the liver. Beautiful little thought experiment that you find. I just digress for a moment. This is William Hunter, brother of John Hunter. And the drawings went missing and the notes went missing for a long time in the UK and were discovered in 1754 by Richard Dalton, who was then the King's librarian. And the first person he showed them to was William Hunter. And he wrote, "A man would examine and see objects which he was to draw. I am fully persuaded that Leonardo was the best anatomist at that time in the world. We must give the 15th century the credit of Leonardo's anatomical studies. he's got his age wrong. He says he was 55 years at the time of the close of the century. We know he wasn't. But the point I'm making, that one of the best anatomists in the world at the time, as soon as he saw Leonardo's drawings, he was absolutely taken with them and realized the importance of them. He wanted to publish them, but unfortunately he died before he was able to do so. This is taken from, thank you very much. This is taken from William Hunter's Gravid Uterus. And if you look at the drawing here by Leonardo of the fetus in the uterus, you wonder whether there was some influence between the two when he actually did these drawings. But again, you have to look at these with a very careful eye. Leonardo was a comparative anatomist, and this is not the uterus of a human being. This is the uterus of an ox, and you can tell by the placement of the cotyledons. But he was illustrating the principle of what he'd seen. Now, not long before, the later part of the 14th century, this was the sort of thing that people were looking at. Personally, I would not want to actually plan a cardiac surgical operation from that. I don't know about you, but that's what they had. And then in 1482, I think Carlo and Martin Kemp date this quite early, about 1482, this appears. This is the earliest of the anatomical known drawings of Leonardo in the Windsor collection. And it's interesting from several points of view. First, this is almost certainly a drawing taken from some kind of studio workbook, of which they were found in the studios of Verrocchio, Paola, and many other studios. So he's taken the concept and he's drawn in cardiovascular system and the genitourinary system. But this little note here says, I need to come back later and look at the liver and the heart. They are very interesting structures, and of course he did much later. Sarah's already shown you the beginnings of the skull drawings. I show them not to enlarge upon that, but just to make the point that he was seriously thinking about producing, or maybe he did produce, we'll never know, a book entitled On the Human Figure. And this is very early in his life, April 1489, and he got very far in his understanding of many parts of the body. These drawings are extraordinary. They're the first of their kind, and there's nothing like it in De Fabrica. And not only do I want you to look at the anatomy of the cranial nerves and the inside of the cranium, but look at the sections he's cut. He's trying to show you how he's actually revealed the interior of the cranium. So he's thinking about not just what the structure is and the function of the structure, but how do I demonstrate it also. Dissection was not a very pleasant thing. There was no preservatives, mainly a wintertime pastime. And Leonardo wrote, in order to obtain an exact and complete knowledge, I've dissected more than 10 human bodies, destroying all the various members and removing even the smallest particles of the flesh which surrounded these veins, without causing any effusion of blood. Now, any of you, all of you who've tried dissection on a cadaver, know that is not easy. So do it on a fresh specimen without preservation, with such accuracy, actually reveals enormous skill. But he was persistent, and he went on and said, and as one single body did not suffice for a long time, it putrefied, it was necessary to proceed by stages with so many bodies as would render my knowledge complete. And this I repeated twice over. So he didn't just accept what he first saw, he looked further to see if his findings could be reproduced. Coming to the heart now, these are some of his early words on the heart. He said, with what words will you describe this heart so as not to fill a book? The longer you write on the details, the more you will confuse the mind of the auditor. You will always be in need of commentators or be required to return to experience we can translate to experimentation, which in your case is very brief and gives knowledge of but few things concerning the whole subject of which you desire an entire knowledge. And those of us who are deeply involved in modern cardiology today know we still only understand no more than 60 to 70% of the actual true structure and function, especially at molecular level, of the heart. It is an enormously complex organ. He said the heart in itself is not the beginning of life. And of course, all the students know it doesn't start to beat until the 6th week of intrauterine life. But it is a vessel made of muscle, vivified and nourished by the artery and the vein, as are the other muscles. So he's saying, you know, as in the bottom quote made by the marvelous instrument invented by the Supreme Master, get serious, be grounded. This is a muscle, it needs a blood supply, it needs venous drainage. So very practical thought. Just a little bit more relevant information at the time. This is taken from Berengar de Carpe's book called The Isagogues, where he commented on Decretum fasciculus and others. And these are the woodcuts in his book of the heart. At the bottom here is Vesalius's from De Fabrica. And I show you this so that when you see Leonardo's heart drawings in the future, you'll see how far ahead he was of both of these ideas of illustration. Now, in the winter of 1507, not far from here, Santa Maria Nuova, he was sitting on the bed of an old man, centenarian. And he said, this old man, these are Leonardo's words, a few hours before his death told me he'd passed 100 years, and that he was conscious of no failure of body except feebleness. And thus, sitting upon a bed in the hospital, Santa Maria Nuova, without any untoward movement or sign, he passed from this life. So he died in front of his eyes. Being Leonardo, he went on, and I made an anatomy, post-mortem if you like, to see the cause of a death so sweet, which I found to proceed from debility through lack of blood and deficiency of the artery which nourishes the heart and the lower members. I found this artery desiccated, shrunken, and with it. Ladies and gentlemen, the first description of coronary atherosclerosis. And this wasn't a passing observation. He wrote at length about this. He said, vessels which in the elderly, through the thickening of their tunics, restrict the transit of the blood, and owing to this lack of nourishment, the aged, failing little by little, destroy their life with a slow death without any fever. And here comes the health warning. He adds, and this occurs through lack of exercise, since the blood is not warmed. And there are other entries that he writes in his notes, going further about this, actually describing the tortuosity and the thickening of the vessels with age, which he illustrates in these diagrams here, versus that of the young person. So he was extremely interested in trying to understand what had caused the death of this old man, and thereby came up with a very apposite observation of coronary artery disease. Now, this is one of the few drawings of the heart that you find outside of the Windsor collection. This is Manuscript G in the National Library of France. It's a little notebook, and Leonardo describes carrying these notebooks tied to his belt and making notes when he's walking around the countryside. And it's full of observations on hydrology. There's a beautiful drawing of a leaf in here and so forth. But inside the cover of this book is this extraordinary drawing of the heart. Now, from what I mentioned to you before, you can see now the heart is a four-chambered structure. It's 2 atria and 2 ventricles. And this is the first time this has been observed as the true structure of the heart. He also, in these simple diagrams, which only he can do so beautifully, illustrates the atrium contracting and the ventricle relaxing. So this is the beginning of the understanding of the synchronicity of heart contraction. Atria contract, ventricles relax. Ventricles contract, atria relax. And there are notes to the side explaining this. Beautiful observation. Now, when he was in Milan, the Swiss Guard invaded and he had to move very quickly. And he went first to Vapriodada with his pupil Francesco Melzi, where he lived with them for a while before going on to Rome. When he was in Milan, in Vapriodada, I am sure, we don't have definitive evidence, but I'm sure that he was dissecting the ox heart and ox structures, the cow. He no longer had access to human remains because he was outside the academic principles and the hospitals of Milan. And I'll show you a bit more of what I mean by that. When he moved to Rome, he moved to live in the Belvedere, and this is the Ospital Santo Spirito, which still exists within the walls of the Vatican. And this very beautiful Renaissance building, I feel sure, is where he would have done some of his original work. Here, if you look to the right from here, you see the Belvedere where he lived, along with the German mirror maker, and Castle San Spirito behind you, just to give you an idea of where he was. Now, at that time, the other thing you have to, and I've been taught so much by true Leonardo scholars like Martin Kemp, reading Carlo Pedretti, Sarah, and other people, that you have to look at everything to understand what you're looking at. And if you look at the color of the paper here, it's blue paper. And architecturally, this is almost certainly paper from Milan, as opposed to cream paper, which you'll see later on from Rome. The top left drawing is taken from a modern textbook of cardiac pathology, and it illustrates the planes of section of the heart to show where you cut to see the septum and the other structures. Excuse me. Now look at Leonardo's drawings. Here he's showing you the planes of section, and you can almost certainly lay one on top of the other. So nothing has changed since his time to the present day in how we expose the heart. The heart, as you know, is a complex cone. It's a cone with a twist. It's quite difficult to actually make the right sections if you're demonstrating it anatomically. Now, forgive me for showing you this. This is the heart and lung block of an ox. So what I thought I would do was try to reproduce Leonardo's dissections. This is what he had to deal with. No textbooks, no one to teach him where to look, no understanding. And he starts with this. And now I'll show you what he found. For those of you, I think there are a few online who may not be medical, I put this in just as a guide to show you the rough idea of the circulation in the heart. The blood returns from the body, from the inferior vena cava, superior vena cava, into the right atrium. Atrium, Latin for hallway, the entrance to the heart. It passes across this valve, the tricuspid valve, into the ventricle, out through the pulmonary artery to the lungs, back to the heart through the pulmonary veins, through the mitral valve, and out through the aortic valve to the body. So this is the circulation as we understand it. No one actually knew this at the time of Leonardo. No one was talking like this. They were talking of the Gallenic circulation, where the heart contracted, the blood went to the periphery, and then it returned. There was no knowledge of the circulation. And in fact, Raul de Colombo and others in Italy suggested the pulmonary circulation. And although Harvey, who wrote De Motu Cordis and hypothesized about the circulation, it wasn't until Malpighi, another Italian pathologist and anatomist, demonstrated on the microscope in the late 1600s that actually was so. So he knew nothing about this. Now, another summary drawing. I said he liked to do summary drawings, again on blue paper. This is a profound drawing. By the way, I don't have COVID. I'm triply vaccinated. I was negative this morning on testing. So if anybody's getting frightened, I just have laryngitis. I apologize. So this is a wonderful summary drawing of the heart. Again, planes of section, the coronary arteries, the aortopulmonary valves, and so on. Now, when these were first seen at the turn of the century, and I believe Kenneth Clark commented, well, this doesn't look like a human heart. Well, it's not. It's an ox heart. And there is the ox heart. And straight away, you can see the accuracy of these drawings. I proceeded with the dissections, and this is Leonardo's dissection of the coronary arteries. The left main coronary artery, left anterior descending, diagonal, circumflex, left atrial appendage. Here we have the real thing, and you can actually impose one on the other. The accuracy is perfect. The relationship of the circumflex coronary artery to the left atrial appendage is here, and he even gets the relationship between the arteries and the veins absolutely right. So again, his gross topographical anatomy is spot on. These little drawings, which look insignificant, are really important, and they show the relationship of the coronary arteries to the apex of the heart. Here he's looking at the aortic valve and the relationship of the coronary arteries to what we now call the sinuses, I think mistakenly, the sinuses of Valsalva. And here's the aortic valve opening. These beautiful drawings are of the mitral valve, and here you can see the very profound papillary muscles of the mitral valve in the ox heart, the chordae tendineae, and the leaflets with the arch shape of the leaflets. But if you look even further, you can see the relationship between the aortic valve, slightly distorted, the aortomitral curtain, and the mitral valve. And actually here, some of the chordae specifically dissected out. Now, when I looked at this drawing, I thought, okay, he's got this wrong. Because if you look here, you see the septum of the heart, right ventricle up here, left ventricle down here, and two giant papillary muscles, and what look like chordae crossing from the papillary muscle to the septum. And we know it doesn't do that. So we think, this is a bit Leonardo's got wrong. Well, I took the same plane of section through the ox heart. And when we did that, here it is, lo and behold, there are these little chordae, exactly as Leonardo drew them. By this time, the hair's standing up on the back of my neck because I'm feeling Leonardo's in the room with me. This is extraordinary. I don't think there's any other form of Leonardo's work where you can do the same as he did, see the same as he did, and actually check the veracity of what he showed. And this became even more interesting. I'll come back to that in a moment. Those of you who know Galen's work very well will know that he talked about septal pores, which the blood cross from the right and left ventricle, and they don't exist. Early observations suggested this was Leonardo representing these septal pores. It is not. These are real. These are crenations in the right ventricular septal portion, because those of us who are cardiologists know that the right ventricle can respond rapidly to volume changes, the ventricle to pressure changes. So the right ventricle has to have this capacity for rapid expansion, for filling. And he's simply drawn correctly exactly what he's seen. I don't know how many of you as children used to do what we call potato prints. You get a potato, cut it in half, carve a picture on it, dip it in the paint and put it on the paper. Well, this is my potato print using the heart of the ox, putting it against Leonardo's drawings. You can virtually superimpose one on the other. It's quite exciting to see how real these drawings are today, exactly as he saw them. If we go to more of the detail of the mitral valve, we see him illustrating primary, secondary, and tertiary chords. And when you look at this, it looks a bit of a scrappy drawing. But when you photograph the real thing, you can see again, it's a very accurate reproduction of what he was seeing. Now, this is one of the most extraordinary drawings of all of them. Here, he's removed the leaflet of the mitral valve. He's removed the primary and secondary chords, and he's left the tertiary chord. I thought, how bizarre is that? So I did the same thing, and we've removed the leaflet, and here is the tertiary chord. And just look how accurate. There is the origin of a secondary chord, and there it is in the real thing. Now, why would a Renaissance artist, events organizer, engineer want to understand the tertiary chords of the mitral valve? Thing is, he was just so drawn to what he saw, he went on looking and looking and looking and recording it all. In that summary page I showed you, in the middle of it, very faintly, is this very little beautiful schematic drawing. And what is this, you ask yourself? Well, it's ropes and pulleys. And what he's showing here is the true way the mitral valve works. Now, all of you know that if you cut out the mitral valve and you simply replace it with a mechanical or tissue valve, a significant number of those patients will go on and develop heart failure, even with a perfectly functioning valve. Because the left ventricle is a complex cone, it needs to be held in that shape and form for optimal function. And when you cut, you break what we call the atrioventricular loop, by removing that connection, the ventricle dilates. And he writes and alludes to the supporting nature of the chordae on the ventricular wall. He goes further. Those of us who, like me, spend their lives repairing mitral valves know that the height of what we call coaptation is important. The leaflets of the valves do not close like the leaflets of a door. They wouldn't work if they did, although the word valvar comes from leaflets of a door. They close like this in what we call coaptation. And this height of coaptation determines the strength of the closure of the valve. Well, I asked the question again, what is the Renaissance artist doing measuring the height of coaptation? Because see the lettering? He's looking at the points of the beginning and the end of coaptation and measuring it. So again, these are modern observations. And if you're a cardiologist using the mitral clip, as you know, you've got to get the right amount of coaptation for the clip to work. You have to get the right amount of coaptation for the repair to work. So again, extremely modern thought. This is a very interesting drawing. This is the papillary muscle and the way it arises from the ventricle. And you know, if you look at MRI scans of the heart, the papillary muscles almost seem to float on the ventricular wall as a result of the trabeculation. So again, he's looking at all of these interesting structures in the heart. Now, I show you this to make the difference between the ox heart and the human heart. This is on cream paper, almost certainly done in Rome. And we're now looking at the tricuspid valve, the right atrioventricular valve. Here you can see the papillary muscles, the chordae, and the leaflets. Here is a human heart opened up in exactly the same plane. Just look at the accuracy. Papillary muscle, same here, cords, leaflets. Extraordinary. And these, en passant, are probably Leonardo's fingerprints in the fat of the animal he was dissecting. We're looking, ladies and gentlemen, at dissection notes from his work in the dissecting room. So let's just pause for a moment, do our own little summary. These are the structures that Leonardo was the first to describe. The bronchial arteries, more of which in a moment. The moderator band in the right ventricle. The sinuses of Leonardo, we should start a campaign, and the aortic valve closure. He demonstrated the heart as a four-chamber structure, atrial contraction separately from ventricular contraction. Cardiac twist, the more of that if there's time, which is now a very hot topic in cardiac failure. And he described the first congenital defect, the atrial septal defect. This is an extraordinary list of new observations which remain true today. Now, I mentioned the moderator band. This is a beautiful drawing by Leonardo of the right ventricle. And I wanted to spend a bit more time on this because you all know if you cut the heart out, whether it's in transplantation or in the pathology room, and you put it on the desk, it just folds up. It's a lump of muscle. So how did he know, without any imaging at all, the actual true expanded interstices of the ventricle as though it were filled with blood? And why was he interested? Well, he was a hydrologist and he knew that fluid had mass and the pressure of contraction interacted with the fluid in the ventricle. And we know today that ventricles cannot function properly if there isn't the right balance between volume and pressure in function. So what he did was he filled the heart with hot wax. He waited for the wax to solidify, the heart to go into rigor mortis around it, excised the heart and removed it. So I thought rather cheekily, I'll do the same thing and see if I can make it work. So this is my experiment. I've adapted it a little bit with Photoshop, but you can see we've completely reproduced exactly what Leonardo showed. So here's another dimension to his work. It isn't simply observation and interpretation and understanding of function and trying to illustrate what he did. It's actually using ways of demonstrating functionality so he can actually demonstrate to others. This beautiful drawing, which looks a bit like a Christmas tree, is actually papillary muscles, chordae, leaflet, 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 moderator band cut down the middle because the ventricle's open. And here is the real thing, cut out exactly as Leonardo did. Here is that little moderator band. Here are those lovely chordae he represented there. And one of the interesting things he did, we don't know if he taught. Maybe he did have access to medical students when he was in Pavia or Padua, I don't know. But he certainly talks here about making a paper model to show how the leaflets in the heart work. So now let's move on from purely structural anatomy to functional anatomy. Form to function. Beautiful drawing of the aortic valve. And when you see the real thing on paper as a few of us have been privileged to do, you can almost see the leaflets fluttering on the page. It's so realistic. I return to the aortic root. Now, Valsalva, no doubt a great anatomist pathologist, described these sinuses with these drawings in a tract on the human ear by Morganus. This is all he did. Beautiful drawings, accurate. But when I show you what Leonardo did, you will see I think we should rename the sinuses to those of Leonardo. But before that, going back to the slow, fast thinking analogy, he said, first I shall do some experiments before I proceed further. Because of my intention, it's to consult experience experiment first, and then with reasoning show why such experience is bound to operate in such a way. But before you base the law in this case, test it 2 or 3 times and see whether the tests produce the same effects. One of the great problems with modern science is people will do an experiment, write it up, publish it, and not go back to it. And it may or may not be right, what they published in their first illustrations. He was a hydrologist, and this is really important in understanding this work. He said, when you put together the science of the motion of the water, remember to include in each proposition its application and use, in order that these sciences may not be useless. In other words, when you are doing an experiment, make sure it's of some use to someone. And his studies of hydrology are extremely important in this. When he was working for the Borgias, Cesar Borgia, this is part of the Arno River, east of Florence. And the bank was wearing away in this part. There were 2 weirs in the river. And he was asked to find out why this was happening and could they put it right. And if you notice, the water's coming from a large space here to another large space there. He reports putting blue dye into the water and observing it. And he noticed these vortices. And he came up with what is still the first law of hydrology, and that is when water goes from a large space to another large space to a small opening, it always follows vortices. He suggested moving the opening further up the weir, and the problem was solved. Well, what is the relevance of that to the aortic valve? Well, if you look at the ox heart, as I've shown you, the aortic root is an extremely bulbous structure, and the blood flows in the ventricle through the outlet, left ventricular outflow tract, to the aorta, large space, large space, small opening. And he presumed they would form these vortices in these large sinuses. So he went on to ask himself the question, why this should be. And these are just an enlargement of these beautiful drawings. Note he also shows primary, secondary, and tertiary vortices. So he went on and looked and looked and looked. He compared with his hydrology knowledge how these vortices formed. And here is a very interesting drawing. If you stand by the bank of a river and you try to see the flow of water, you can't see it much unless you drop something in it and watch it flow. Modern hydrologists use laser light. And this does look very much like a laser light tracking of water flow in modern times, but this is Leonardo's idea. I've got a little bit here, thank you. He went on to look at what we now know as fluid drag, laminar and non-laminar flow, and the effect of this of the flow, where it flows less against the wall of the vessel than in the center. Putting all of this together, he concluded that the closure of the aortic valve begins in late systole. In other words, the ventricle contracts, blood goes through the valve, and the vortices form and unfurl the leaflets before the blood pours back in diastole. And he wrote at length about this, many pages. And if you want, you can read how he described that at that point. And he described at great length why this was the case, how it expands to fill the leaflets to make them open properly. And he goes on also to argue against himself, saying, well, if that's not the case, what would happen? He said, if it doesn't happen, the leaflets would fold up like so. and the valve wouldn't open, close properly. So it's a very detailed experiment that he's done. And he went on to design a model, a glass model. So sorry about this. A glass model where he took the wax heart, injected wax into the ox heart, and then made a glass model by the lost wax method, and made the aortic roots. And he said, make this test in the glass model and move inside it water and plant grass seeds. So he pumped tiny grass seeds into this circulation and was able to demonstrate these vortices you see down here. Not only did he do that, he also designed the very first synthetic heart valve, which you can see here. These are modern day laser light images showing the tracking of the fluid that I mentioned before, demonstrating these vortices. And this is taken from a modern day textbook anatomy. And I think Leonardo's drawings are rather more beautiful than all of those. This is Pacioli. Pacioli was a mathematician with whom he moved from Milan down to Rome at the invitation of the Pope. And he was trying to learn mathematics, and this gentleman tried to teach him. I'm not sure how much success they had. But the only book that Leonardo published in his lifetime was with Pacioli of the geometric drawings, and this is one of them, these geometric solids. This painting by Piero della Francesca. So he did get something profitable out of Pacioli, but how much he understood, we don't know. But he did say, he who does not know the supreme certainty of mathematics, so the word's dropped off, is wallowing in confusion. In other words, the importance of statistics, which is very true today. Now, in 1967, two engineers in Oxford, Bellhouse and Bellhouse, repeated the experiment. They demonstrated that Leonardo is right, and it's the only paper I've seen in Nature with just one reference, and that is 500 years old. But what would be particularly pleasing to Leonardo is that it had 6 pages of mathematical proof to back up his discovery. So I didn't stop there. I thought I would go on and do my own experiment. And this is a human heart, an MRI scan with the structures of the heart removed, just showing the flow of blood. And if you look here and here, you can see directly the vorticil formation in the aortic root of the heart. So Leonardo was absolutely spot on. We looked further at the effects of vorticil formation in the rest of the heart. And if you look, you'll see it in all the chambers of the heart. And it assists in mitral and tricuspid valve closure. It's led to some work that I've done with the Hammersmith Hospital, where we show that as hearts fail, these vortices break down, and the whole flow of blood, pattern of flow through the blood changes. But once again, he didn't stop there. He went on to describe how it is important for the aortic root to be elastic so the valves didn't tear themselves out of the aortic root on closure. And this has been very important today in the development of stemless valve technology. He didn't stop there. He went on to say, why does the aortic and pulmonary valve have 3 leaflets, not 4 or 2? And this is the very first drawing ever of a bicuspid aortic valve. And one wonders if you saw it, because it's really quite accurate. And using his limited knowledge of geometry, he demonstrated that the height of the leaflet, because of the triangulation, was greater in a quadricuspid valve than in a tricuspid valve. And that's why they fail. I mentioned cardiac twist. He was apparently sitting on a hillside somewhere in Tuscany at a barbecue, watching them kill the pigs for the barbecue. And he noted that when they put the spikes through the chest to kill the pigs at different angles, they had different moments of rotation. And he concluded that the heart must twist when it's beating. And he found through experimentation the point of equipoise, which you can see here. Now we know, and for the medical students in the audience, you know no cardiac myocyte can contract more than 20% of its length. So how do you empty the heart on exercise? Well, the answer is like a towel. When you've been swimming, you wring the towel out, and the heart literally wrings itself out. And this wringing of the heart is so important in heart function, and it gets lost in advancing cardiac failure. I also mentioned the bronchial circulation. He describes here why it's vital that the lung has two sources of blood. That through the pulmonary artery and that through these bronchial arteries. Now, when any of you are in the dissecting room, how many of you found the bronchial arteries? Not many, I suspect. They're quite difficult unless you've got cystic fibrosis. But here he draws them beautifully, showing the bronchial arteries running along the course of the bronchial walls. So in our dissection, we did the same thing. Here's the trachea, here is the aorta, there's the bronchial artery, exactly as he showed. And this is an MRI scan showing exactly the same thing that Leonardo drew all those years ago. And here we are in the dissection. Here is the bronchial artery going off the aorta to the trachea. And once again, I show you this to remind you this is all that he had. No books, no support. Well, coming to a close, I'm sure you're pleased with my voice, but he wrote what he thought about us doctors. He said, "Endeavour to preserve thy health, in which thou wilt succeed the better, the more thou guardest thyself from the physicians. For their mixtures are a kind of alchemy on which there are no fewer books than there are remedies." In other words, stay away from the doctors if you want to survive. And his comments on working hard as a day well spent brings happy sleep, so a life well used brings a happy death. Thank you very much indeed. May I apologize again for this? It's not very pleasant for you, but it was quite difficult for me too. So,
You need more?
please. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Professor, for this wonderful lecture. I wonder if anyone has questions from the audience. You can also speak in Italian, you translate your question.
Do any of you wonder what people of the period might have thought of Leonardo's anatomy, and whether anybody saw it and it meant anything to anybody? You ever raised that question in your mind? Such superb. This is just one aspect of it. Sarah showed you beautiful muscular anatomy and so forth. Does it ever cross your mind as to what people thought of him? Who knew about it? Obviously not. Well, it is an interesting question. You know, why wasn't it better known? And if he was intent on publishing it, and did he work with an anatomist in Pavia called Marcantonio della Torre? There's a suggestion that he did, and Vasari refers to it. The one reference in Leonardo's notes is returning a book on the waters to Marcantonio, but he could equally have been a hydrologist or somebody else, not necessarily an anatomist. So it's not really entirely clear as to what was going on at the time, why people didn't.
Marcello, please come here. Could you come here?
Mm. Mm. Indeed. Mm. Mm. Well, he may have become an irrelevance because of not focusing enough. But also, you see, there are so many factors. The total extent of knowledge in those days was nothing like it is now. I mean, Sarah may have a better idea, but I think he just was such a man interested in so many things. But you have to remember, this wasn't his day job. I mean, he was an event organizer, he was an engineer, he was supposedly an architect. I mean, he was doing all sorts of different things. You could really perhaps look upon this as some kind of hobby, but with his own personal intent. I think the most profound thing about him was his ability to look and see and understand. And then in the middle of all that, you know, whether the academics at court in Milan, in Florence, and Rome would take him seriously enough to allow him to actually develop his ideas is also a point in question. And I mean, I know from academics today that even very bright minds have their ideas suppressed by rather nasty senior academics. So it hasn't changed a lot in many ways. I don't know.
Could you come here? Come here. No.
About do you remember the concept of anatomical treatise, the Fabrica? We were talking about that at the Academy of Fine Arts of Venice on Friday. And now thinking about the fact that there was this idea, this wonderful project with Realdo Colombo and Michelangelo, and on the other side, Leonardo da Vinci and Marcantonio della Torre, we never thought about that, but did they knew something? Did they knew they were both planning somehow?
Interesting.
Because in fact, there was a lot of rivalry between the two.
Mm.
And we were mentioned on Friday that obviously, compared to the Leonardo, what's happened, the Fabrica carry on, Vesalius had the chance to create the first amazing treatise, also because he was an anatomist moving everything with the help of a wonderful artist. On this side were two great artists, also two monsters of the Renaissance, that were actually planning with some anatomist, some two treatises. So, you know, we never talk about that, but...
No, it's right. I mean, the whole link with Marcantonio della Torre is an interesting one. His father, Marcantonio's father, was a very well respected physician in Verona and Padua. In fact, so well respected that one of the artifacts that Napoleon stole from this wonderful country was his tomb and took it to Paris. So the family was known. And there's another painting I saw in the National Gallery recently of another della Torre physician. And I want to talk to Sarah and the others about, we might research what connection there was. Marcantonio died young. He died in his late 20s of the plague. He was obviously an extraordinarily clever man. I mean, in the early 20s, he was a professor in Pavia. And I suspect, I mean, how much of what Leonardo drew was taken from Marcantonio's dissections and how much is his own, again, we will never know, I don't expect. And going back to the analogy with Michelangelo and rather Colombo, I mean, Colombo didn't, his work wasn't published until after his death. His son published it. And again, there was a fascinating painting that was reviewed recently that was probably added to after his death, putting his text on anatomy there. There is that engraving in the School of Anatomy, which Michelangelo is said to have founded with Colombo, of him sitting at the foot of their drawing the anatomy. But there are just massive holes in our knowledge. And, you know, Michelangelo was so busy, he was a moody chap and all sorts of problems. I mean, you know, how much he was able to complete. Leonardo had all his own distractions. Vesalius was a physician. He was an anatomist. That was his focus. So he trained in it. In the Low Countries, he went down to Pavia, to Padua, and that's what he did. He didn't do anything else. So it's a very different thing. And it may be, you see, that there is something in the academic criticizing the artist in terms of application. You know, they may have known what he was doing and say, for goodness sake, Leonardo, why don't you get on and publish that book you keep talking about? But we don't know, do we? And the other thing, of course, is there was a bit of bad blood between Michelangelo and Leonardo. They're not the best of friends. So it's fun. It's a Dan Brown story, isn't it? It's not reality. We don't know. We just don't know.
Thank you for your contribution of this meeting. And excuse me for my funny English.
Not at all.
So, two questions. The first, what do you think about the decision of Anatomical Science Society to eliminate eponymous name from anatomical structure?
Sorry, just try it again.
So, Cuore di Leonardo became expression without the author.
Without authorship, you mean?
And Leonardo has different eponymus. Trabecula di Leonardo, Recessio di Leonardo, Vena di Leonardo. So if decided to eliminate this reference, is very pity for the authors and.
But he didn't publish it.
Okay.
Well, indeed it is. I mean, it is a great shame he didn't publish it. And I suspect there was a great deal more. I mean, Professor Martin Kemp and indeed Carlo Pedretti felt strongly there was an awful lot more that got lost. And when he died, he left it to his pupil Melzi, who was supposed to catalogue it. And some of the Roman numerals you see on the drawings are Melzi's, impressions. But he never did it properly. But Vasari knew the work was there, and I'm sure others visited, and it is reported that some people took drawings away. And if it was you, would you take the best drawings or the worst drawings? So, you know, a lot of his best work may be missing. And it could well be that stuff that was getting close to being ready for publication was that which went missing, and we'll never know. And the second question?
And another. This about Leonardo. When you say that Earth has a twist, we don't forget that word Earth became from Sanskrit word Earth.
From the Sanskrit word. Oh, totally, yes. That's really the origin of
what is we intending dancing.
Well, we do. I mean, you're quite right. I mean, the whole Renaissance science was based on the retranslation of the Sanskrit, Ibn al-Sina and so forth.
And the history of the anatomical studies, we don't forget that the first anatomist was where the people who prepared food.
Yes, that's true. But of course, you can go back even further. Erasistratus described the heart valves and described the function of the heart valves.
The last word is interesting to know the characteristic of description of Leonardo of the structure anatomical. So when was the 600th anniversary of the Leonardo, was produced a glossario of Leonardo description anatomical, and very interesting about this aspect.
Oh, indeed, absolutely. A lot has been thought about since.
Thank you.
But we have to remember, as you quite rightly say, Leonardo was widely read. I mean, certainly he had a significant library. He was aware of Aristotle, Hippocrates, Galen, all of these things. So, you know, he was distilling all this, which is why we haven't really had time to go into it. But his early heart anatomy is Gallenic. He describes the Gallenic circulation in his own way. But he did a beautiful experiment to show, again, we talked with the medical student beautifully presented how Vesalius disproved a lot of Galen. Well, so did Leonardo. He showed that the airway did not connect to the left atrium. He did a lovely experiment to say it by tying on trachea and so forth. So he was battling his way through all this. He hadn't had the luxury of sitting in lectures and being primed with all of information. He had to gain it all for himself. But very quickly, he started to challenge what he saw in his later anatomy. I mean, the early anatomy is marked by the wonderful method of dissection and description in drawings. The middle bit is sort of developing all of that, still very Gallenic. It's the third episode, from 1512 onwards, where he gets into true modern functional thought. And he's basically saying, forget all that, I want to look for myself, which is original.
Could we say that if for other well-known artists of Renaissance, such as Michelangelo, Raffaello, the knowledge of anatomy is the basis of their wonderful work. As for Leonardo, we could say that This is the first time that physiology is considered by the observer. How much physiology is in the anatomical description by Leonardo?
Well, going back to your first point, Michelangelo, Raphael, or Paolo brothers, Rocchius, all these, I mean, they will have seen dissections and varying amounts. But of course, it's also an important point to make that, you know, the average worker, well-built, strong man, you could see the muscles and bones and sinew through the skin. You didn't actually need to dissect them. So I think a lot of it, and if you go to The Battle of Fighting Men, is it by Paolo brothers, the anatomy is so distorted, the muscular anatomy is so gross. And Leonardo described Michelangelo's anatomy as drawing muscles like a bunch of nuts. So, I mean, you know, they were doing different things. And I think, you know, even painting for Leonardo was an experiment. He was working out new glazes, new way, and that's why probably he toured with the Mona Lisa till his death. He was playing with it and trying to work out ways of, and the recent book by Martin Kemp brings all that out extremely well. So it's an interesting thing as to what he was doing, why he was doing it. I think it was more of a sort of general natural philosopher than is actually a true anatomist.
I would like that also our medical students could come here, please, ask a question. Please tell your name.
My name is Maurilio, and I'm in the first year of medical here at Sant'Anna. And thank you for your wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
And I was wondering if Leonardo had some kind of education about the how to present those drawings, because we've seen many drawings that were really clearly presented, like the skull, the sagittal view section of the skull, or other sections of the heart. And with that, how Leonardo really affected the history of medicine and anatomical drawings?
Well, it's a very good question, well phrased. I mean, if you talk to the historians of medicine, they would tell you not at all, because he didn't publish and people are not aware of it. And what I'm talking about now is very much a retrospective view. I mean, what he did was known, and one of the emissaries from the Pope visited him in Amboise and reported a huge collection of anatomical drawings. One thing I didn't show you was going back to Berengario da Carpi, which we've been researching. In the first edition of his 3 editions of the Isagoges, he has, I'm not sure if you can quickly go back to them, he has a drawing of the uterus, which looks as though it's copying Leonardo's drawing of the uterus. Now, Berengario knew Michelangelo, Raphael, knew of Leonardo, and is known to have taken a Raphael painting in payment for his work. He was a surgeon in Bologna. Get there in a minute. I've gone past it. I think so. On my way back. Yes, if you look at this drawing here of the uterus, it has 2 large lateral ligaments, which the human doesn't have. And the quadruped has it because the pregnant quadruped, the uterus is hanging down. And if you look at the first edition of Berengario's Isagoges, he has a pregnant woman in a birthing chair with the abdomen open, and the uterus is drawn exactly like that. In the second and third editions, it's gone. So we don't know, but you wonder, did he see Leonardo's drawing? Was it, because there's more than one drawing showing this of Leonardo's. Did he think, okay, that's how it is, we'll put it in? And then latterly, his colleagues said after publication, no, that's not how it is, and he changed it. So who he impressed at the time, how useful the work was, very difficult to say. We can never know now, I don't think. It's a shame. It's a great shame, because he could have made a big impression at the time. But the other thing you have to think about, of course, I've been talking about advanced cardiac physiology. I think you'll agree what we've been talking about is stuff we use today. You know, when we're thinking about the heart, there was no use for this in 1512. There was no heart surgery, there was no medicines to approach it. People didn't understand. It wasn't until William Withering in the early 1700s that heart failure was understood, the dropsy and the introduction of digoxin and so forth. So, I mean, it is a fascinating thing, isn't it? He should get so close to the truth in something that was truly blue skies thinking that nobody could make use of for many, many years to come.
So he was the first to draw anatomical drawings like that.
Of this kind?
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I showed you there's some woodcuts from Berengari's work. There's work by de Kettem and so forth. Very crude. Not at all anything you could use functionally. I haven't got it to show you, but there's a wonderful illustration from de Kettem's Fasciculus of the lecturer reader sitting in the professor's chair, reading from Galen. There's the body being dissected by the prosector, probably a local butcher. And then there's the lecturer pointing out the demonstrator, the anatomy, and all the medical students around look terribly bored because I suspect what the reader was reading has no relationship to what they were seeing on the table. So it was a very interesting time in terms of trying to understand how anatomy was used then. Most of it was for trauma, you know, broken bones, bloodletting, that sort of thing. There was very little that could be done usefully for internal problems.
And the last question, if I could. Then you have talked about Leonardo experiments, and he said like he started from practicing, from the experiment, and then went to reason.
Yes.
And how do you think that this kind of approach influenced then the scientific method, the Galilean scientific method, that is the contrary, starting from reason and then going to...
Well, he did say start with reason and work through experiments. He does contradict himself a bit.
Okay.
But I don't think so. I don't think Galileo would have been aware. He may have been, but we don't know. Sarah might know, was he? Did Galileo know about Leonardo's work? I don't think so.
Please could come here, please.
Yeah.
Otherwise, people are not able to understand.
It's known that when Leonardo died, all the drawings and the manuscript by Leonardo was banqueted by Francesco Melzi. And Francesco Melzi took all the drawings and the manuscript to Vatrio d'Adda at his house nearby Milan. And all these boxes full of drawings were kept there until 18th century. And some was dispersed, but some was, kept away from the interest of scientists. So I think that the main reason is this.
Nobody saw them. Well, there's one possible exception, and that is William Harvey, because William Harvey was physician to Duke of Norfolk, Lord Arundel, who was ambassador to Venice for a time. And they were traveling around Europe together. And it was through the Duke of Norfolk from Pomiglione, the direct link is a little obscure, the notes were bought. And after he had them, he couldn't travel back to England because King Charles had his head cut off and he was a royalist. And it's hard to imagine that they would be traveling around Europe with a bunch of Leonardo drawings and he didn't show them to Harvey. Interesting thought. Yeah, who knows?
Thank you.
Please come here.
Hi, my name is Picardo from the first year of medicine. In my life, I met many doctors and surgeons, mainly focused on the healing aim in empiric way. And I was wondering what we should learn from the double view of the human body, both artistic and scientific, for our future life and job.
It's a very good question. The arts-science relationship, I think, should be taken much more seriously. I've had artists in residence with me, and they open your eyes to things that you don't necessarily see. And it's becoming much more profound today. I mean, there's a whole university of art science in Texas. And I think we need to think much more and more widely for all sorts of reasons. But the artist is looking at life in a slightly different way, very different way. We are very focused, we're very narrow, they're very broad. And I think we can learn a lot from each other. And I think actually, developing a broad interest in the arts as well as science is something that's very good for anybody who's interested in science and trying to understand it. Also, you see, what Leonardo teaches you is to not be afraid to ask questions. Don't just accept what your professors tell you. Ask them difficult questions. Don't necessarily believe what they say. Go and do your own research and think about it. Keep your eyes wide open and think about what you see, not what other people tell you to see. And it's that sort of thought process that we get from reading Leonardo that can actually influence people today. I have a separate lecture I could show you of, I changed my style of mitral valve reconstruction through this. Now, Leonardo didn't teach me how to do it, but he made me look at the mitral valve in a different way, to look at it as a force field at the end of systole. Completely changes your view about the way the valve works. So I think there's a lot of interesting analogies that can be made and useful information transferred from the arts and the sciences.
Thank
Good
you.
question.
Thank you.
Please come here. While she comes, I'm asking, do you think that in the near future anatomical drawings, which have been the basis for our education, will be substituted by three-dimensional CT and MRI imaging in the medical student education?
It's a very good question. It's a very pressing question. The whole teaching of anatomy is changing, isn't it? And I don't think it's all of it's good. I think dissection still has an important part to play to understand the anatomy. However, you can use the imaging of MRI in real time, functioning in CT and so forth, to help actually improve that understanding. And then simply, I mean, I would advise all medical students, learn a piece of anatomy, sit down with a blank piece of paper, and then draw it for yourself. If you can draw it and reconstruct it in 3D, you know it. You know what I mean? And then you can sell them to somebody else.
Good evening, sir. I have two questions for you. The first one is, having said that Leonardo's drawings were kept away for so many years, I can recall my professor of history of medicine taught us that if they hadn't been kept secret, actually we might be very ahead of our times in medicine. And the question I want to ask you is, how many years ahead can we be? Actually, a century, given that medicine is not only anatomy, but is also many other techniques such as instrumental exams, MRI, and so on.
Yeah, well, it's changing all the time, isn't it? I mean, had it been available, who knows? He didn't put it together. Well, he may have done, but we don't know as a single work or text that you could use. But a lot of the ideas are there. But the actual knowledge is progressing and changing all the time. And I think as we move more into molecular biology, into biochemistry and the understandings of the workings of the cell, the interaction with pathology and organisms and so forth, it's a bit like looking at the universe. We're looking, deeper and deeper and deeper into it. And trying to understand those functional relationships with all of these methods is really important. So, but to start with a good knowledge of the human form is your roadmap for the future. Then you can start to ask questions about all parts as disease processes evolve. A classic example is COVID. You know, beginning to understand the interrelationship of the virus with the vessel wall, the endothelium, probably the most important pathological relationship in that disease process. And then you start to look at the structure of the virus, the structure of the cells in the cell wall. It's all anatomy, it's just a different level, isn't it?
The second question is quite related to the first one. And I wanted to ask whether there are other drawings, other sketches from Leonardo that depicts other pathological features of the heart, not only atherosclerosis, but even normal hearts versus pathological hearts, and if he has contributed not only with an anatomic view, but also with a clinical view, with considering if those hearts were those of people with certain symptoms and signs in
Sadly, not really. I mean, the centenarian dying of coronary disease is the one very specific example. The other is the description of the atrial septal defect, a hole between the hearts. And he says, I must look further and see if I can see that in any others. But it then raises the conjecture of how much of his anatomy was human, how much was it comparative anatomy, because he talks about comparing what he finds in the human with birds of the air, the animals of the field. So it's a great comparative anatomist as well. So in terms of morbid anatomy, I don't know of any more. Do you, Sarah?
I was thinking to the drawing with Francesco Melzi, with the young boy with the heart.
With a heart, yes. Yeah.
Maybe that one?
Yeah, whether it's emotional or whether it's pathological.
Yes, I know. But
This is a drawing that Sarah's referring to. I think it starts with a drawing of the heart in section. And then around it, he draws the outline of his very naughty assistant, Salai, who traveled with him everywhere and caused all sorts of problems. But I think Leonardo was very affectionate towards him. So, you know, quite what that's all about, we don't know.
part of the heart.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you, sir. And I haven't said to you, great lecture.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Bianca. And I would like to finally thank Professor Tarozzi, Professor Tagliagambe for giving us the opportunity to have the sixth Pedretti Lecture here at the Scuola Sant'Anna. And I would like to thank Professor Wells for his wonderful presentation.
And I'd like to thank the Pedretti Foundation for inviting me. Thank you.